Hey guys, I'm Hannah Cox with Base Politics, and you're watching my show, Copaganda. This week, we don't actually have footage of the case when it actually went down, but we do have video from one of the survivors after the fact. We're going to watch her testimony and then get into what happened to her as a result of this case.
They had asked me around 4:30 if they could go out and play. And they checked in just about every hour. And so I knew when they didn't check in with me by 5:30, something was wrong. I was afraid. I couldn't believe that he would do that, and so I told the police.
Colorado law requires police to arrest anyone who violates a restraining order, but Jessica says the officers did not seem very concerned.
Because their first reaction was, well, he's their father. It's okay for them to be with him, and I said, no, it's not okay.
Instead of sensing danger, the police were treating this as merely a domestic spat.
I practically read the restraining order to them, and I said, well, what if he doesn't bring them home? They said, well, you call us back in a couple hours.
Jessica says she read them the part of the order that instructs police to use every reasonable effort to protect the children, to prevent violence. And she told us she begged and pleaded with the police to get her girls. When 10 o'clock passed and the girls still had not returned, Jessica says she called police for the third time, and they told her to wait until midnight before calling again. At midnight, she drove to Simon's apartment. He wasn't there, so she made her fourth call to the police, and then, fighting panic, she says, feeling frightened and frustrated, she drove to the police station, where she told yet another officer about the restraining order and that her girls had been gone for 7 hours. And then she went home. At 3:20 in the morning, according to the police, Simon Gonzales drove here to what was then the site of the Castle Rock police station. The police say that he got out of his truck and began to shoot into the building, into the police station, with a semi-automatic gun he had bought that evening just after he had picked up the girls. The police returned his fire and they shot Simon dead. And when the cops looked into the cab of his truck, they found the bodies of Rebecca, Catherine, and Leslie. And the autopsy showed that Simon had shot each of his daughters in the head at close range after leaving the amusement park, which meant that he'd driven around with their bodies beside him for several hours. Jessica's attorney, Brian Reichel, who will argue her case before the Supreme Court, says police didn't need to know about Simon's bizarre behavior. They just needed to follow the law. Colorado is one of 30 states that passed a law instructing the police to arrest people who violate restraining orders.
So there is so much we have to unpack from this tragic case. While he said that over 30 states have passed laws saying that police must enforce restraining orders, which you would think would be common sense, the reality is that nothing of the sort is occurring. And in fact, Jessica's case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, where she lost. I'll say that again. She lost at the Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled 7-2 that Ms. Gonzales had, quote, no entitlement to police enforcement of the restraining order. They said neither the U.S. Constitution nor any federal law give her or her children the right to individual police protection. She wasn't asking for individual police protection. She was asking them to enforce a restraining order when it was clearly being violated. The court also said that the states have no duty to protect the rights of an individual from violation by third parties. This is a pretty damning court case, and it's one of many we've gotten throughout the 2000s where the court has ruled that police basically have no duty to intervene or do their jobs, to which I would still like an explanation of why we have to pay them then. I would be better off keeping my tax dollars and paying for private security when I actually need it, which is why some people in the policing reform circle are starting to float ideas of police choice, where you can opt in or keep your tax dollars and use it to fund your actual own security, since so often we see that they're not doing their jobs. In fact, restraining orders have come to be known as the paper tiger of the legal industry. It is widely known that these things are nothing more than symbolic, something to put in front of a judge and try to show a preponderance of evidence that somebody is increasingly a threat or might harm you. But really, police often don't even record it when people do violate these restraining orders. As you can see from this graph, which is just looking at LA, but it's a pretty significant sample, there are way more reports of people violating restraining orders than there are actual documented cases of police noting those violations. This says that in LAPD, they received 5,126 calls about domestic violence restraining orders, but only filed 765 reports of restraining order violations, less than 15% of the total, and that was in 2021. Now, it's important to know that domestic violence is an increasing problem in this country. In fact, according to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner. For Black women and those in the LGBTQ community, domestic violence occurs at an equal or even higher rate compared with their white heterosexual counterparts. That's a lot of people facing very serious, significant threats. People can ultimately be murdered by their significant partner. And for women, this is actually one of the top threats we face. But one reason that we might see police being more hesitant to actually get involved in these domestic disputes and enforce restraining orders is that police have a rampant problem with domestic abuse amongst their own ranks. In fact, research suggests that family violence is 2 to 4 times higher in the law enforcement community than in the general population. And to date, this field of work has one of the highest rates of domestic violence amongst all fields. Of course, that's not to say that all police or even most police are domestically violent themselves, but it is saying that a significant percentage of people working in this field do have these same issues and probably are more sympathetic to people who are abusers themselves. Additionally, as we saw in this case with Jessica, there's also a tendency within the courts and policing to be somewhat overly deferential to parents. Now, I am not somebody who typically advocates for getting the state involved in parenting. I think having a child removed from parents and put into state custody is one of the worst outcomes imaginable and should be reserved for instances where the child is truly in danger. But that being said, when it is very apparent that one partner is being domestically abusive to the other, which it was in this case, and it was for most people who obtain a restraining order. You can't just get these out of thin air. You have to be able to show a pretty good burden of proof that you have been harmed by this person, either through medical records or witnesses or some other kind of evidence that you've gathered. And it can cost thousands of dollars to get a restraining order. Even though most states have waived the actual filing fees, most people feel they need to get an attorney to go through this process. So somebody who takes on the effort to get a restraining order is typically not doing it just as a way to get back at somebody. This is a pretty significant burden to meet. I don't think it's a huge leap to think that if one partner is violent towards the other person, that they might become violent to the kids. And in those kinds of situations, we shouldn't see the courts continuing to be so deferential just because somebody is a parental figure. They ought to actually take the child's safety, make that the most important thing in the entire equation, and ensure that somebody who has been domestically violent towards their partner doesn't have a chance to harm the kids instead. But what we actually end up with is instead the Supreme Court making excuses for police departments who don't enforce restraining orders whatsoever. And until we see actual repercussions, actual accountability, I don't think we're going to see these rates improve. I also don't think we end up with a system where police actually focus more on solving and preventing violent crimes versus shaking people down in the streets for tickets or trying to break down doors to seize some weed until these kinds of laws and protocols get flipped. The incentive needs to be on police to intervene. Their dominant duty should be to protect people's lives and property, and right now the system is completely upside down. That's a wrap, guys. If you like this episode, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. And until next week, stay based.